Parachutes at sea level. I've landed them at 13,000 feet up in the Himalaya. I've flown 500 square foot tandem parachutes and 300 square foot tandem parachutes and pretty much everything in between. So while I'm an incredibly average tandem instructor, I've had a lot of experience in different realms within the tandem universe. So I'm here today to talk to you guys about tandem canopy flight, basically the evolution of it, where we are today, and ultimately everything that I'm going to talk about has to do with this principle that two bodies can't occupy the same space at the same time, right? We're all familiar with that. And unfortunately, despite it being a law, an irrefutable one, we tend to challenge it each year somewhere around the world with tandem canopy collisions. So hopefully this information today will help give you guys a little bit better insight from my perspective, some of the things that I've seen and learned over the last few years. I would challenge you, however, not to take anything that I'm saying today as fact. Question everything I offer, and if at the end of the day you're having dialogues amongst yourself about the information that I've offered you, then I will consider this a job well done on my part. I just want to give you things to think about. But before I start, I'd like to ask a question. If anybody here owns a drop zone, can you raise your hand? Okay, manages a drop zone? Okay, keep your hand up. Tandem instructor. Okay, videographer, tandem videographer. Okay, keep your hands up. Packers. Anyone ever send a friend or relative to make a tandem jump? Okay, almost every hand has gone up. Okay, you can put your hands down. The reason why I ask you to do that is to emphasize the fact that tandem skydiving doesn't just concern tandem instructors. The entire drop zone is involved with the tandem process. From the pilot to the drop zone owner to the riggers to the packers, the videographers, the friends and family we send to the drop zone. Everyone has some impact and influence on the tandem program. So with that said, I'd like to begin with understanding the dynamics of modern tandem canopy flight. Start with the video, because everybody likes videos. Some of you probably saw this on YouTube. Okay. Principle, two bodies can't occupy the same space at the same time. No one got terribly injured in this, and I'll preface it. I'm going to show you another video at the end, and again, nobody gets truly injured or killed in these videos. I just want to give you some examples of how some things go wrong in our sport. So, the key factors that I want to talk to you about today regarding tandem canopy flight are maintenance of the tandem parachutes, the skill level of us, the instructor pool, communication among tandem instructors, different landing patterns, inducing speed to land, different types of landings, different canopy sizes, the effects of wing loading on tandem canopies, effects of turbulence, and knowing when to stand down. That's probably one of the most important topics we'll cover. That's why I saved it for the end, so it'll be the last thing you think about as you leave the room today. So maintenance is pretty easy. How many of you here are tandem instructors? Again, okay. How many of you have read your tandem manual from cover to cover? About half the hands usually go down, right? Those of you that kept your hands up, thank you. A Cessna pilot reads the Cessna manual from cover to cover because he needs to know about all the operating parameters of that aircraft. We should treat our tandem systems the same way. If we're going to jump a system, whether it's a Sigma, Vector, or any of the other tandem systems that are out there, all of the manufacturers have their operating manuals online for free download on their web pages. So I would encourage you, if you haven't read your manual, read it this year. Leave here, go home and download the PDF file and read it from cover to cover. Okay. Next part, in terms of reducing canopy issues, is having properly trained packers. We can actually reduce our cutaways and thus our reserve rides and thus having to ride reserve parachutes by making sure that our tandem packers are packing their tandem parachutes properly. Do we have any tandem packers here? Okay. Do you guys pack tandem parachutes the same way at the beginning of the season and at the end of the season? Yep. Really? Okay, most people don't. Most people, they learn a process, they take the manufacturer's procedures, they put a process together, and then little by little over time, they start to deviate from that procedure. The reason they deviate is maybe it's a busy day. Maybe normally a 12-minute pack job needs to be done in 10 minutes, right? And what's the easiest way to make a pack job faster? Skip steps, right? Just drop it down the ground. And we see we get away with it, and then we do it again. Then maybe we learn a faster way to fold a drogue that might not be the way the manufacturer wanted it. So over time, packers tend to deviate from a standard packing procedure. So 12 people trained to do the same thing on January 1st are probably doing 12 different things at the end of December. That's not bad or wrong, but it's just something we should recognize. And using the manual, every year we should be doing Packer re-education or continuing education courses just to make sure we're still doing things the way the manufacturers want us to do it. Next part is perform timely inspections. How many of you change the oil in your car when you're supposed to at 5,000 kilometers? Or is it 8,000? Okay, no one does, right? We drive our cars until they break. We don't replace our tires until we start skidding and sliding. Our brakes don't go until the car won't stop, right? We treat our cars terribly. And unfortunately, we treat our parachutes just the same. The canopies go out of trim, we keep jumping them. I learned an expression in Australia in May called, "she'll be right." Does anybody know what that means? Are these lines okay? Yeah, she'll be right for one more jump, right? If we put timely inspections into our packing schedules, we'll be able to solve problems when they're small before they become large problems. Small problems are patching a hole in a canopy. Large problems are chasing down a main canopy you cut away that's in a tree and replacing a $600 drogue assembly or free bag and reserve bag. So timely inspections are important. And then especially in the US, one of the things that we emphasize is logging your maintenance. Just like the aircraft needs 100-hour maintenance schedules logged to be airworthy within the FAA, tandem parachute systems should also have logged maintenance schedules so that if and when there's an incident or an accident and your Civil Aviation Authority inspector shows up at your drop zone, you have the information available that you've packed the parachute in accordance to manufacturer's requirements through the manual. You have maintenance schedules through log maintenance to show you're keeping up with the 25 jump maintenance that we recommend on the equipment. All that does is help protect you if there's any liability or any lawsuits. I'm not sure how prevalent lawsuits are here in the UK, but in the US you can get sued for even saying the word lawsuit. It happens all the time. So we do everything we can to protect ourselves from lawsuits. And last but not least, know the life limits of your components. What is the life limit on a set of main risers on your tandem system? Anybody know? It's until they break, right? That's the life limit. You jump it until one of them is not there anymore. Actually, depending upon the riser type and the line type, there's different life limits for the canopy. And if you look in the manual, you'll actually see that listed in there. The life limits are approximations. They're not exact. You guys jump in really great weather. You've got, well, not great weather, great conditions. You've got grass. You probably pack indoors. Your risers are going to last longer than risers jumped at Skydive Arizona, where they're jumping in 118-degree temperature, sandy conditions. The packing isn't air conditioned, so people are sweating all over the gear. So life limits are a subjective idea, but it's important to know what they are. If you do all of that, you'll have lower malfunction rate, less reserve rides, there'll be less canopy incidents on your reserves. Okay, now we'll start talking about main parachutes. Main parachutes, skill level is really important here. How many of you fly Velocities or JVXs or cross-brace canopies? How many of you fly your tandem canopies the same way? Hopefully no hands go up. There are people out there, if you can believe it, that use their tandem canopies to train for CP events, canopy piloting events. They fly their tandem parachute just like they fly their sport parachute. What's the problem with that? There's a lot of them. What are some of the problems of flying your tandem parachute like a high-performance wing? Absolutely. You have a student on the front. You have another human being that paid for a safe tandem flight back down to the ground, and by making high-performance turns, we're actually reducing the safety margin for the tandem passengers in the front of us. So there's no good possible reason to fly our tandem parachute like sport parachutes, but unfortunately, people are doing that. Might be you, might be someone on your drop zone. If you see it, recognize it and address it. This is all about correction, polishing the process. This isn't about pointing at people and saying you're bad or you're wrong. We'll get to pointing at people later, but for now, it's just saying, here's some things that are going on out there. If you see it, you recognize it, fix it. Next one is a false sense of security. We call it ego management. How many of you are awesome parachute pilots? Come on, every hand's got to go up. We're all great at what we do. We're all really good parachute pilots. We're all really good at flying our parachutes because we make hundreds, if not thousands of jumps without getting injured, right? Whether it's our sport parachutes or our tandems, we fly all the time, week in, week out. Well, here it's probably month in and month out. You guys get to fly every couple of months. But you don't hurt yourself when you land your parachute. What happens? Our ego starts to get a little bit better, bigger. We start to think we're better than we are because we haven't really met any challenging conditions. So we start taking higher risks, bigger turns. And it's not too long before someone comes along and gets in our path that now things have changed. Now we have a problem. and which results in the potential of a canopy collision. So the better we get, we have to recognize that ego is a human nature trait. We all have somewhat of an ego in terms of how well or how poorly we fly our parachutes. Just make sure you're keeping not just your canopy flying in check, that you're keeping your coworkers, your other staff members' egos in check in terms of tandem canopy flying. Now this here, the concept of a prorated instructor is one of my favorite ideas in tandem jumping. You guys call it a display rating, right? So what's the regulations for a display license if I wanted to earn one here in the UK? I want to jump into a stadium. What do I do?
5 jumps into a 50x50 arena.
Okay, is it complicated? Not really. Okay, but the accuracy component, pre-declare 5 jumps in a row in the same spot. I would ask you to consider for yourself, if you're a tandem instructor, or for the staff that you work with, ask them if they can land a tandem parachute 5 times out of 5 in a row, pre-declared, in a 50-meter square, or we would say a 30-meter circle in the US. That's our US prorating requirement. If they're not able to do that, do you think that's a problem? Yep, absolutely, right? Would you believe that there's hundreds, if not possibly thousands, of tandem instructors out there that have been trained over the years that don't know how to accurately land a tandem parachute? See it all the time with videographers. What happens? They're coming in, they're going out, and then you see the videographer having to run after them, probably swearing, probably yelling at them. It happens. The reason it happens is that we've really suffered over the years in forming or focusing our efforts on accurate canopy flight. It's the same thing in sport skydiving as it is in tandem, and it just carries over. Skydivers are not really good at landing in the same place at the same time. Just one of the things that we see. So if we go home tomorrow, back to our drop zone, and we start watching all of our tandem instructors landing to the left, landing to the right, landing everywhere but the P pit, and we start thinking about this conversation, what can we do to fix it? Can you guys see that at the bottom there? Canopy coaching. If there's a problem, we're obligated to fix it. Maxine Tate's here with Flight 1. That's one option. Flight 1 offers a course called 101T Tandem Flight. It's not a free plug for her, but it's a great thing to look into. Doesn't have to be a Flight 1 course at an expense. It could be your instructors getting together and putting a plan together. I'm sure you have basic canopy flying training you provide AFF students, right? It's basically the same thing. Downwind, crosswind, into the wind, starting at certain altitudes and using certain ground references to make your turns, right? It's not difficult to train canopy flying in a basic student environment. So if for some reason your instructors are unable to accurately land 5 out of 5 times in a pre-declared space, get them training, make it fun, work together, emphasize the reason why you're doing it. Because if we can land on the same spot, we're less likely to injure ourselves, we're less likely to injure the tandem students that are with us. And while I'm at it, can you land a tandem parachute downwind? Absolutely, yes. Safely? Yep. Can you land the tandem parachute crosswind? Absolutely, you can do it safely. So, while it's something we'd like to strive for, landing into the wind, wing level into the wind, it's not an absolute requirement that we land into the wind. A lot of injuries occur in tandem skydiving because we make low turns to the ground to get back into the wind. A lot of broken legs. If any of you are familiar or play cricket, cricket bat, it's a pretty solid piece of wood. Okay, your femur is about the same density as a cricket bat. Okay, if these landings are hard enough that they would snap a cricket bat, snaps your leg, you can imagine the impact that these tandems are creating as they make these low turns into the ground to turn back into the wind. So I just want to emphasize it's not required to land into the wind. And if we're not comfortable landing crosswind or landing downwind, what can we do? Help me. Get canopy coaching. Talk to someone. Develop that confidence. Do it under a controlled environment, perhaps with another tandem instructor or an experienced skydiver. Do it with your friends before you have to do it with the first-time jumper who's nervous and weighs 100 kilos like me. All right. How am I doing? Am I talking too fast? I'm from Boston, so I tend to talk really fast, and I'm over-caffeinated too, so please, by all means, don't hesitate to tell me to slow down, slow down. All right. Next thing I want to talk to you about in regards to tandem canopy flight is communication. I'm going to talk about 3 specific pieces here. This middle one is going to be one of the most valuable pieces of information I'm going to give you in this entire 50-minute period of time, so hopefully I have your attention. But the first one we're going to start with is ground to air. How many of you have a proper communication process from your manifest office to your pilot, from your pilot to your instructors, to let you know if the winds have gone above a wind range that is suitable for getting out of the aircraft. You took off and it was 18 knots, you're on jump run and it's 26 knots, and you don't want to get out of that aircraft. Do you have a proper communication process in place?
Yes. Yeah.
Does it work?
Yeah. Yes.
Most of the time, good, okay. Because the worst thing we want to do is get out of an aircraft and find out the winds have changed and now everybody's standing outside because they want to watch the carnage. I used to work in New Zealand. I spent a season down there at End Zone in Queenstown, and we would regularly jump in 26, 27 mile an hour winds, and clean winds were fine, but when it got to be turbulent, you'd see the rest of the staff standing out there, and you'd be coming down to land and you'd see 17 other red jumpsuits. They just wanted to watch the canopy collapse and watch the carnage, so you knew you were in trouble. And anytime you saw your staff members out in the landing area, they weren't there to help, they were there to watch. They just wanted to see the carnage occur. And that was just, every now and again, basic lack of ground-to-air communication. Could happen anywhere. Here's the important one, air-to-air communication between tandem instructors. How many of you jump in turbine drop zones where you might have 2, 3, 4, 5 tandems at the same flight? Okay. Going back to this theory that we can't occupy the same space at the same time, if there's a tandem canopy collision, it's probably going to be close to the ground. Why is that? We're all trying to land in the same small piece of land. We're all flying an accuracy approach that I just talked about. Everyone's trying to land in the 30-meter P-pit there, right? 2 canopies come down at the same time, and what happens? They either collide, like is what happened here, the video I showed you, or one of them or both of them make a low turn to avoid the other one. Neither of those are good options or outcomes. So what can we do to prevent that from happening? This is the important part. If Craig and I are flying 2 tandem canopies and we're on the same level at 3,000 feet, how is Craig going to let me know he can see me? He's going to kick his legs, right? The universal sign for I see you. And as the other tandem instructor, what am I going to do to let Craig know I see him? The same thing, right? I'm going to kick my legs. So we've now established visual contact with each other. And that's great, but it really doesn't do too much for us. We do it at 3,000 feet, we do it at 2,500 feet, we're still on the same level, right? We're still descending at about the same time. So in this same example, again, Craig's flying along, I see him kick his legs, I kick my legs back to let him know I see him, and then Craig looks over and he sees me doing this. What am I doing? I'm sitting in brakes. For those of you that are canopy pilots, I'm slowing down, I'm looking at Craig. When he sees my arms out, I'm telling him to do what? Go first, okay? Descend and get below me. If you incorporate that one procedure into your daily operations for tandem jumping, you will never have 2 tandem instructors trying to land on the same level. Now, it requires a sense of cooperation amongst us. We need to be able to work together as a team. If Craig sees me out here holding brakes and he turns around and goes, no, I think I'm going to stay up here, well, that's going to create a conflict, right? So we have to be on the same page, but if we are, and we use that one process, we can virtually eliminate any level issues with any 2 tandems on the same load. And it can happen with Craig and I first. Now I've dropped down. Now it's with the next person. We do the same thing, and you can continually do that so that one is staged above the other throughout the canopy descent. All right. And last but not least, air to ground. Do any of you have processes in place where as your pilot is descending, they're actually trying to count the canopies as they're coming into the patterns, make sure they see that there's 3 exited, there's 3 good canopies over their head, or if they see 2 good canopies and a reserve parachute, they can actually radio down to manifest and let them know before the parachutes even land that there was a problem or that everything is okay. There are some larger drop zones that have pilots that will do that. They will make a wide circle around the canopies as they're coming in, and please believe me, I'm not encouraging any pilots to fly through tandem parachutes. I'm just saying it's possible for pilots to see what's going on and they can radio down, especially in a Cessna drop zone where it's a small place, 2 canopies. But having some form of air-to-ground communication is also helpful in the event of an emergency.
Tom, it's a requirement in the UK to have a nominated person on the ground who is counting canopies for that very reason.
Perfect. Awesome. So you guys are already one step ahead of that. Excuse me. All right, so let's talk about landing patterns next. If I were to come here to be a tandem instructor from the US and start jumping at any one of your drop zones here, I should be able to integrate myself relatively easy into your tandem program. And the reason I should be able to do that is that if you have a solid program, you're flying a predetermined pattern. It's the same pattern over and over again. for the most part, we have what we call predominant winds, right? Winds typically coming out of the same direction day after day. That's why they call them predominant. So we typically have the same pattern over and over again. The winds might change, but if the winds change, we simply change that same pattern. We rotate it to make it fit the new wind direction. So it's pretty simple stuff. But you'd be surprised how many drop zones out there don't have a simple predetermined pattern that's both predetermined and predictable. Downwind, what comes after downwind? Crosswind. No, we got to fly over the farm first to get around the power lines to then get back in behind the tractor. No, it should be downwind, crosswind, and then what? Into the wind. A simple, basic pattern. For those of you that travel, I'm sure you're aware, it doesn't always work that way. A lot of times they remove the crosswind and the downwind is right over the top of the landing area. So you need to be careful of where that pattern is, that is predetermined, predictable. And here's an interesting one. It should be a pre-established order. Wing loading and weights, they're not rocket science. We know based on the size of our parachutes and the size of our passengers that the heavy passengers, the 100-kilo passengers, are going to descend faster than the 50-kilo or 80-kilo passengers, right? So if I'm the 100-kilo passenger and I'm the last tandem out on a load of 6, and there's lighter people in front of me, what's going to happen on my tandem? We're going to descend through the others simply because I weigh more, right? So if you have a heavy passenger, why not consider putting them out first? That will reduce the probability that the heavy passenger or possibly the small parachute, anything that's going to increase your descent rate, put that out first. Now you're not having to fight through the lighter tandem passengers and the larger parachutes with the lighter wing loadings. Going back to the example of Craig and I communicating to each other, something I try to emphasize with drop zones that I work with and talk to is trying to create a culture of it's okay to hang out. You don't have to be the first one down. Now, usually the person that has the biggest problem with that is the aircraft owner. Why is that? Jet fuel is expensive, right? You ever throw dollar bills into a fireplace? Well, that's a turbine spinning on the ground, right? Just sitting there burning fuel, not making any money. So we all have an inherent anxiety about getting down to the ground fast. Even if we don't own the aircraft, even if we're not paying for the fuel, we hear that prop spinning and we see the plane sitting on the ground. We're just anxious. We got to get down to the ground, right? Well, when we have an anxiety about getting down to the ground, we tend to rush things. When we rush things, what tends to happen? We tend to miss things. We tend to create conflicts with our friends. So one of the things I try to encourage with all drop zones is try to encourage a culture of hanging out. You don't have to be the first one down. Craig and I don't have to race to be the first one down to get a smoke break or to pick the lightest passenger for the next load or to get the best parachute. That we have a culture where it's okay. We don't have to meet the aircraft. We're not going to get in trouble if we choose to let the other person go in front of us and create a safer environment to descend and land in. Unfortunately, that's a real struggle, but it's something I'm always trying to preach and emphasize is that rushing tends to create a lot of chaos. And if we can reduce the rushing by having that culture where it's okay to fly stacked patterns one at a time, don't rush to get down, you'll have less canopy conflicts because less people will be fighting to get down the ground at the same time. And last but not least is a concept or a person that I refer to as the express elevator. A lot of drop zones have an express elevator. That's the person that no matter where they are on the load, they could be the first tandem in, the last, or anywhere in between, they're always the first one down, okay? They cut through your pattern because they want to get a cigarette in before the next load. They want to make sure they get the brand new harness container. Maybe there's a pretty girl manifest and they want to run down and get the next passenger. They don't want to get stuck with the rugby player. So there's a number of reasons why the express elevator acts the way they do, but they're always the first one down. They're the most dangerous person to have in your tandem program because they create a component of unpredictability on every tandem load you put up in the air. The only thing predictable is they're going to land first. Everything else is chaotic. You don't know where they are. Instead of focusing on your pattern, what you're doing, you're looking for him or for her, trying to find that cannonball that's going to fly through your pattern. And when you do that, it creates a ripple effect, and it takes our focus off of what it should be, flying that predictable pattern back to the airport. Okay, the next thing I want to talk to you guys about is inducing speed to land. There's 3 basic ways to do that. What do you guys think about the idea of inducing speed to land before I start talking about it? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing?
Good.
It's a good thing. Who said that? You're right. Why is it a good thing?
Speed equals lift.
Say that louder for everybody.
Speed equals lift.
Speed equals lift, yes. Okay, so when a parachute has some speed attached to its landing, it's going to generate a greater flare power when you come in to land. Now, when you have high wind days, speed isn't really a an issue because the wind is acting as that speed. 14-mile-an-hour headwind, you can pretty much have a stand-up landing every day regardless of the size of the person. But when we have a no-wind day, coming in fast versus coming in slow, when we come in slow, it's kind of mushy. People flare, and what happens? Just kind of flop out of the sky. That little extra speed can help give you a more powerful flare at the bottom end of your landing. So I just want to address what people are doing in the field today, not to say any of these are right or wrong, except for the last one is totally wrong. The first two have no opinion either way, better or worse, but just want to talk about both and the positives and negatives of each. So what's the sink surge approach? Somebody tell me. Flying in, who's half brakes? We sit in half brakes, we get to about an altitude. What's the altitude we wait till? The right altitude, right? The reason I say that is, thank you for mentioning that. It takes a little bit of finesse, learning what the appropriate altitude is based on the size of the parachute and the person underneath you. We let the parachute up, it surges forward, generates that speed, gives us a nice solid flare at the end of it. What's the benefit of that sink surge landing? Keeps parachute over my head, right? I've kept a square parachute over my head the entire time. Are there any drawbacks to a sink surge approach? What are some of the negatives?
Too low.
What happens when you're too low?
You put your fingers into the ground.
What's that?
You put your legs in the ground.
Yes, you smack into the ground. What's the other problem with it? What if it's too high? What happens?
You lose all the speed.
It planes out about 10 feet off the ground, and we come down straight on our butts, right? So it's a matter of timing, and when it's done properly, it works very well. Call it finesse. When it's not done properly, you can have a hard landing from basically landing still in the descent. You can have a hard landing from planing out too high. So it really requires a tremendous amount of finesse. And of course, because the parachute sizes and the people change throughout that process, that actual altitude can change and vary from person and condition. What about a carving turn? What's a carving turn?
Slow, steady turn with some predictability.
Yes, it's a brake turn, right? We're in full flight. We're making a carving, nice, wide, 90-degree turn or less that allows us to build up some speed. We let that brake turn up, surges forward. We now have our full flare in front of us. Okay, a nice, powerful flare. What are the benefits of that landing?
You've got a lot of outs in it. You've got time to plan when you stop it. So
Absolutely.
Low, you can stop it a bit early.
What if you do if you're too low? You stop early.
Flare early.
Yep. What if you're too high?
You can continue it a little bit as long as there's no other traffic nearby. That's
The little bit is the most important part of that, right? If you're the last one coming down, you have a lot more leverage. But if you're the first one coming down and someone's following behind you, and now you've made too wide of a turn or even too short of a turn, potentially you could create a conflict for that person behind you. So if you're at a drop zone that practices carving turns, you have to be prepared for and aware of the fact that your instructors you work with may or may not initiate the turn at the right altitude to land specifically or directly into the wind. Any other negatives of a carving turn?
It's a turn.
Yep, you're still turning. The wing's not totally level over your head.
And when you're turning, you're less likely to be looking for other traffic, and you create unpredictability for other traffic near the time of landing. And in theory, you don't want turns anywhere near the time of landing.
Exactly.
That's when most canopy collisions occur.
Yep. So there are negatives to both of these, but when done properly, they can both provide the necessary speed in a controlled environment, slow-paced, that gives you speed for landing without jeopardizing the safety of you and the passenger you're with. Now the last one is the toggle whipping hook turn. What is that? That's an old school technique, right? That's before riser turns ever became popular and as parachutes got smaller. That's when tandem instructors make a big toggle down to their hip turn. It swings them out like a pendulum, and they swing back underneath the canopy, building up lots and lots of speed. There's really nothing positive about it, so let's focus on the negatives. What are some of the problems with that type of landing? What happens if we initiate it too slow or too low, and we're still penduluming out of that turn as we hit the ground?
Canopy doesn't recover in time, and you haven't got any really inputs. You don't have a properly working canopy.
And what's the last thing you see before they impact the ground? The tandem instructor doing this. And he just jams the toggles down all the way, and the canopy will come back over his head, but they'll go straight down to the ground because they still have downward momentum. So that's one of the easiest ways to break an ankle or a leg of yourself and or your passenger, by initiating toggle whipping hook turns. For what it's worth, while the term toggle whipping hook turn is not in the manual, UPT does not allow or authorize these aggressive high performance turns. We're actually going to publish a new manual, an updated version at the USPIA symposium at the end of March, and it will have all of these scenarios and techniques in there. But hook turns are bad, they're banned. All right, so let's talk about the different types of landings. Slide and landing. Everybody is familiar with that? Okay, what's the positive of the slide and landing?
Can't fall over.
You absolutely cannot fall over, absolutely. Anything else?
You won't get dragged backwards on landing.
You won't get dragged backwards on landing, okay? There's some drop zones that require slide and landings. So if you guys are familiar with Skydive Paris out in California, one of the largest turbine drop zones in the US, they have a slide and only policy. Because from them, they realized after doing an audit of their stand-up landings and their slide-in landings that the injury rate on stand-up landings was like 100 times greater than the injury rate on slide-in landings. Now, the caveat to that is that if you're going to do slide-in landings, you need to do it on a pitch that is as smooth as a football field or a golf course. You can't do it if there's rough terrain, right? So what happens if there's rough terrain? Get a foot stuck. You could potentially break an ankle or break a leg. So we have to be careful of the conditions that we use to slide and landing. And also our jumpsuits get dirty, so you want to make sure you have somebody else's jumpsuit on if you're sliding in your landings. And actually leg pads, additional leg pads over your factory ones might actually help increase the longevity of the gear that you're using. What about the stand-up landing? What are some of the benefits of a stand-up landing? It's rock star. Everybody wants to land standing up. They see it in the video and they go, can I do that? And when you say no, what happens? You look bad because you have an ego and you want to look good. Stand-up landings have their time and place, and it's typically in high wind scenarios. There are some times when simply sitting down a parachute is not the safest thing to do, and when we've got 14, 18, 20 mile an hour winds, if you try to slide in the landing and you land and there is no slide, you end up going backwards. And it's easier to give a catcher the toggle when you're standing than trying to do a slide in landing. It's just easier for them to catch you. So slide-in landings, or excuse me, stand-up landings have the potential in high wind scenarios to be a safe alternative for landing. We're not recommending one or the other. The downside of a stand-up landing, however, is that if we collapse parachute too high and have a hard landing, basically every joint from our feet to our ankles to our knees to our hips to our back to our shoulders to our neck to our head, everything has the potential to get injured, compressions. So if you're going to choose to do stand-up landings, you need to make sure you're doing it in a soft area, like a pea pit, or a soft pitch like the football field. Rocky terrain areas aren't the best place for stand-up landings either. Now, what's a run-out landing or a tabletop? How many of you have an $800 or greater jumpsuit? Bought a tone fly suit or a vertical suit? It's got to be at least one free flyer in here, right? Somebody's got to have a, thank you. All right, so you've got your $800 free fly suit and you've got your $100 or 100-pound poly cotton ugly tandem suit that you use for your tandem jumps. And then you did a free fly jump with your buddies and the drop zone owner says, one more jump before the day is over and you got to go right now. Now you find yourself wearing your tandem harness and you got your $800 suit on. You get training tomorrow. You're like, I'm not going to get this thing dirty. Or worse, I'm not going to burn holes in my free fly suit. There's no way I'm sliding in this landing. You've already decided that before you boarded the aircraft. There's no way, conditions be damned, I am standing up this landing, okay? So it's sunset. What happens when the sun sets? The winds go away. So we're landing no wind condition, brand new $800 jumpsuit with the passenger in front of us, and we're coming in hot. And we should be sliding this landing in because we have speed and we have a smooth pitch to land on, but instead we're thinking about our vertical suit, we're thinking about tone fly, not our passenger, and we flare and we start swooping. And we start running, and our passenger starts running with us. And then what happens? The passenger's feet and knees drop out because they're not as coordinated as you are under a parachute. And then what happens? You have nowhere to go but over the top of them, hence the tabletop phrase, okay? We've all seen it, right? Somebody has splattered on top of a tandem passenger, maybe not because they didn't want to get their jumpsuit dirty, maybe it was ego, but we all see it out there from time to time. This, like the express elevator, the tabletop is one of the most dangerous people out there in the field. You really need to avoid this type of landing. And last but not least, going back to the ego thing, finish your flare, okay? A flare starts up here, right? And it ends down here. We all agree relatively, you know, can make minor arguments, but it starts here and it ends here. your flare doesn't start here and end here like you're swooping a pond trying to show off on sunset load on the beer line with your friends. Can you land the tandem parachute without flaring? Yes, you absolutely can. You can land the tandem parachute on rear risers. Should you? Absolutely not. Should you be landing a tandem parachute and flaring just enough to plane it out and let it swoop across the ground? No, you should finish your flare. You have the flare there, use it. So go back, watch your tandem instructors, see if they're the kind of tandem instructor that starts a flare and finishes a flare, or if they're the ones that come in and try to look like the PD factory team swooping across the ground in half brakes. This is where we see a lot of sprained and broken ankles at the end because the canopy just drops out. It stalls at a higher airspeed rather than finishing the flare. All right, so canopy sizes have changed over the years. Thankfully, there's no longer 500 square foot tandem parachutes out there because they're a pain to pack, right? And they're a pain to fly. Pull your toggle down and what happens? Nothing. And about a minute later, it starts doing this. Well, now today we have modern ram air parachutes designed with similar characteristics of sport parachutes. That's why they open so soft, why they're so fun to fly, and why they land so well. Whether it's 400 square foot parachute or 300 square foot parachute or anything in between, you just need to make sure you have the right wing for the right job. 300 and 340 square foot parachutes are really popular on beach drop zones. Why is that? Beaches are usually really windy, right? So in high wind scenarios where you're constantly jumping in high winds, in New Zealand we jumped 330s and nothing larger because we couldn't jump anything larger. Some of the flatter farm-like drop zones that have a lot of low wind scenarios, larger parachutes, 370s, 400s are good. But what we need to recognize is that every time we change our parachute, we change our wing loading. Now granted, it's not a lot. It's not like taking a 1.0 wing loading and going to a 3.0 wing loading like some of the swoopers do. We're going from like 1.4 to 1.45, from 1.6 to 1.3. We're still jumping and wing loading, but it's not as catastrophic of a difference. So the reason I bring it up is that what this change in wing loading does create is it changes the initiation altitude of your turns to land. What altitude do you turn with a 370 square foot parachute and a 200-pound passenger? It's not the same altitude with a 340-foot parachute and a 200-pound passenger. The 340 has to start the turn higher. It's a smaller parachute. It's going to descend deeper into the turn. So that turn height changes every time we change either the wing loading of the parachute through size or through the size of the passenger. Rule of thumb, go heavy in winds. As a team, when we have tandem instructors working together and it's a windy day, the heaviest tandem instructor should have the lightest student, and the lightest tandem instructor should have the heaviest student. Give everybody the best chance for making it back by making each tandem as heavy as possible. That you're going to create a situation where you don't have the lightest tandem instructor taking the lightest girl and they're getting blown over to the next county while everybody else is back having lunch. You want to make sure everybody has the highest wing loading possible within that group of people and passengers to make sure everybody can get back in heavy winds. So all of that is condensed into the idea of planning for success. Weights and sizes change, but we're all professionals. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize we have one or two different size parachutes and a multiple different size passenger base, and each one of them affects their canopy flying and descent rates differently. If you think about it like a golfer, why does a golfer pick a 7-iron versus an 8-iron? Because it's a shorter club, it goes a shorter distance, right? Why a driver versus a 2-iron? Look at your equipment in the same manner. Your parachutes will go a certain speed and have a certain descent rate. And that envelope of performance from the lightest passenger to the heaviest passenger will change that performance. Okay. I said that the leg thing and the arm thing was the most important topic I'm going to cover. This is the second most important topic. I think we're doing good for time too. I greatly appreciate you guys letting me run through all this. How many of you jump on drop zones that have turbulent locations? Okay, you know where they are, right? Hangars, taxiways, tree lines, things like that. I'm going to tell you a story. I call it the story of the turbulence tree. The turbulence tree exists in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Okay? It's a beautiful field, just like you have out at your drop zones here. Beautiful fields, beautiful farmland. There's one tree in the middle of the landing area, and it's called the turbulence tree. Why is it called the turbulence tree? Because the wind blows through, hits the tree, and creates turbulence, right? Every every tandem instructor on the drop zone knows about the turbulence tree. And because they know about the turbulence tree, they also know not to do what? Fly over it, right? Avoid it, avoid the turbulence tree. So predominant winds are out of the west 90% of the time. So now we have a day, predominant winds are out of the east, okay? We're used to our sight picture of flying back from the west. Now we're going to the east, which shouldn't be a problem because we're all experienced skydivers, right? Well, one of the earlier tandem instructors has an issue checking his drogue and he's holding up everybody else, which happens to all of us from time to time. So now we're long on the spot because people are taking too much time on the door. And here comes my buddy, we'll call him Neil. Neil gets in the door, he exits the aircraft and he looks down and he says, wow, we're long, okay? Opens up, now he's coming back from a long spot. He's coming back from the east when he's used to coming back from the west. And he realizes at about 1,000 feet, he has no other option but to overfly the turbulence tree. He's not going to make it back to the primary landing area without flying over the turbulence tree. So what happens? Canopy collapses, right? He does what every good tandem instructor should. He puts himself underneath the passenger. Passenger walks away without a scratch. Neil breaks his hip. His right hip socket shattered. What's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is you have a highly experienced, highly intelligent tandem instructor who'd made thousands of tandem jumps to this drop zone. He knew about the turbulence tree. He avoided it on every jump except for that one, and that one broke his hip. Well, what happened? It was a domino effect. We fly out of the west every day. Now we're flying out of the east. We usually get good spots, but now we have a long spot. If it had happened out of the west, being long out of the west was no problem. Why wasn't it a problem? It was because he had a soccer field to land in, he had a football field, or you guys call it, yeah, sorry, did I say soccer? Football, or lacrosse field. He had all kinds of sports fields, and he had farmland to land in. And he landed off hundreds of times over the years. But out of the east, he didn't have any outs. Well, wait a minute, I just got through telling you guys it was farmland all around. Why didn't he have any outs to the east? He never looked at the overhead from the east to say, if I'm long, how can I avoid this turbulence tree? He never asked himself, how do I avoid the turbulence tree from the east, the north, or the south, until he had no choice but to fly over it. So had he, even that morning, looked at the overhead of the drop zone and said, you know what, if we're getting out here when I'm normally getting out here, and if I get out long, well look, there's a farmer's field here, there's a schoolyard here, there's a street if I have to here. I have options to land out to avoid having to fly over the turbulence tree. He didn't do that, didn't give himself any options. So you've all acknowledged you have turbulent conditions on your drop zone. You know where the turbulence is. Mark where it is, educate where it is, and most importantly, prepare alternate landing areas, not just for your daily operations of normal predominant winds, but for the days you don't have predominant winds. That's the day it's going to get you, and that's the day that you're going to potentially fracture your hip like my poor friend Neil did. So he likes that I tell this story because learn from his mistake, learn from his issue. Hopefully you guys will go back and address the different locations where you can land in a 360-degree radial, not just the predominant wind direction. Okay, so not to pick on my friends in New Zealand, but when we were down there and the winds were getting terrible, we had one tandem instructor who was lighter than the rest. And when his canopy started to collapse, that's when we knew it was time for us to start packing up and calling it a day. The heavier guys would go 1 or 2 more loads, but the light guy, we'll call him Shane, when we started to see Shane's end cells flapping, we knew it was time, getting close to call it a day. But the thing is, we didn't know exactly when to sit down. We didn't have a clearly defined wind limit or process for either. So everybody had different wind limits to sit down on. Shane was the earliest, the lightest. He had to sit down usually at like 24 knots, and the rest of us would sit down at 26 or 27. And then the biggest, heaviest guys could go 28 or 29, but it was chaos, you know, because one by one people would walk off the loads, and then you would see instructors standing there going, oh wait, watch this. Here comes Shane. His canopy's going to collapse. This is going to be awesome. Well, we know it's kind of funny because we're skydivers and this is something that we do, but what happens to Shane's friends or to the passengers' friends and family with Shane who are standing there listening to you make fun of this potential catastrophe? And what's worse, today they're doing this. And what are they doing? They're recording everything you're saying. They're taking pictures of everything that's going on. So we need to make sure that we just look at sitting down in a very basic process. First of all, define your limits before you reach them. And it could be a seasonal thing, it could be a daily thing. You know what? If it's 22 or above, I'm not going. And then Craig might say, if it's 24 and above, I'm not going. Well, we can solve that on the ground before we board the aircraft. It's one thing for the two of us to board the airplane and him to get out and me to stay in the airplane. It's another thing altogether for me to just not get on that plane. If I'm not on that aircraft, I've created no scenario where someone could misinterpret the conditions to be unsafe. So just think about it ahead of time. And then base your limits on conditions and experience and canopy selection. 3 years ago, or God, it's 5 years now. 5 years ago, in 2009, when I was in New Zealand, I would consistently jump in 28-mile-an-hour winds and not think twice of it because I was current, I was flying small parachutes, and I was really good at what I did. I'd wake up in the morning and my arm would go up to throw a drogue. That's how many drogues I was throwing. Today, I probably have less than 50 tandems on the back this year, but like 150 on the front as a passenger in courses. So I'm nowhere near as current as I was 5 years ago. What's happened to my experience level? It's gone down. So now I'm not happy jumping at anything over 22 miles an hour because I'm just not current on it. So I base my limits on what my experience level is. And then last but not least, don't make a show of it. Don't be the guy or girl that has to stand there and say, it's too windy, it's too dangerous, I'm not going, I don't want to do this. Because what do? You've just sold all of your friends and drop zone owner employees down the river because if there is an incident, now you've opened up the drop zone to an unsafe practice. That camera of the passenger's family is going to have recorded you saying it's too unsafe, it's too windy. Have all of these conversations and staff meetings in private before the day starts, before the season starts. Meet once a month to talk about it and address it so it's current. And at the end of the day, if you're the one that decides to sit down because you're being responsible and professional, leave. You can come in, Tom, if you want. Walk away. It's time for lunch. I'm taking a late lunch. I'm going to play video games. I'll be back in an hour. I'm on break. If you are there, you're a witness. If you are not there, you cannot be tied to any problems that might occur. So think about it on a macro level with your friends and family in that regard. Okay, so in conclusion, educate yourself on the gear, the training, and conditions. Demand professionalism of yourself and everyone you work with. In New Zealand, they're all now commercial pilots. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. The Civil Aviation Authority has termed tandem parachutes to now be commercial aircraft, and the tandem instructors have to go through many of the same medical and training requirements of pilots down there now because it's considered an industry, no longer a training environment. So demand professionalism of each other, stay current, have staff meetings with each other, and the day you stop respecting what we do is the day you're going to lose what we do. I asked you guys all to hold your hands up earlier. How many of you make any part of your income in skydiving? Okay, good. Tandems are tied to that. Tandems give you bigger aircraft. Tandems give you air-conditioned packing. They give you well, maybe not air conditioning here, a heated packing here, okay? The reason I say that is that tandems are everyone's concern. I am my brother's keeper. We're all on the same team. So I started with the horrendous video. Nobody got hurt. I'm going to show you another video now. Before I do, at the end of the day, the last component of this educational module is this. I've seen a lot of things in the last 9 years that I've been doing this. I investigate a lot of incidents, a lot of fatalities, a lot of injuries. One of the things that sticks out statistically more than anything is that if you make a turn over 90 degrees, you drastically increase the chance of a grave injury and or possibly a fatality. If you make a turn less than 90 degrees and make a mistake and hit the ground, you're probably going to walk away with either a bruised ego and a dirty jumpsuit or at worst, maybe a broken ankle. You tend not to see the catastrophic broken legs, shattered hips, fatalities, things like that. That typically does not occur until you've made a mistake over 90 degrees. So if you can limit yourselves to turns of 90 degrees or less, you can effectively ensure that you're not going to gravely injure or kill any of your tandem passengers or yourself, which is, I think, a good thing for us to all shoot for. Why is this so important? Kind of close with a conclusion of mine. How many of you were making tandem jumps 25 years ago? Anybody? The gear was really scary back then. It was dangerous. Rings were bending in half. Canopies were blowing up. Drogues were getting pulled off of equipment. Well, today, tandem parachute systems, thanks to Bill Booth and Ted Strong and everybody else involved in the tandem program over the last 30 years, they've made the gear safer, okay? 30 years ago, if you were going to get killed in a tandem skydive in 1985, it was probably due to equipment error, open container, or worse, human error through equipment error, okay? Bad pilot decisions with bad equipment. Today, they've basically solved all the equipment problems. if you guys are jumping Sigmas, you know I'm talking about. You can't have an open container in free fall, the Collins lanyard, the Skyhook, all these auxiliary tandem systems in place to make the system safer. Bill Booth has a law, I think it's called Bill Booth's Law 2, is that no matter how safe we make the equipment, skydivers increase the danger factor to keep the fatality rate at a constant. The gear's not doing it anymore. It's now us. It's now how we're flying tandem parachutes. If you're going to be involved in a fatal or gravely injurious tandem incident, it's not going to be in free fall. Statistically speaking, it's going to be under a perfectly functioning parachute, and the part that's malfunctioning is you. Okay, so that's why I give you this information to think about it. Don't agree with it all, agree with some of it, but talk about it either way. That's the important thing, and keep your turns under 90 degrees.